Hello, hello, Professor. Uh, Good evening to those watching from India and good afternoon to those watching from Italy. My name is Bhargavi. I am the senior editor within the Council for Global Cooperation. I'm pleased to present to you the first online interview organized by the Council for Global Cooperation today. So the CGC is an international non-partisan forum aimed at tackling global issues that shape our modern world through independent research, analysis, and open dialogue. The CGC serves as a platform for extensive research, commentary, analysis, and informed dialogue that promotes global cooperation. Our council has established its priorities for major political, economic, social, and geopolitical issues regarding professional research and academic analysis. The major projects and pressing themes we have undertaken and focus are on genocide, Holocaust and disaster studies, foreign policy, Cold War, studies on Third World, and international area studies. This organization aims to provide analysis in depth and solutions for the global policy, informing the people and analyzing the crisis and suggesting peaceful and effective resolutions. Today, we have the distinguished pleasure of listening to an expert in the field of European politics about the new day that has dawned in the continent. We are talking, of course, about the unprecedented win of Giorgia Meloni and her party, Brothers of Italy, and the new right-wing coalition that would be ruling Italy. A lot of people around Europe and the globe are watching with worries and doubts for the future of Italy and the European Union after the arrival of this right-wing government. To gather more insight, today we have with us Professor Antonio Zotti. We welcome you, sir.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Professor Antonio Zotti is a research fellow of Europe program at Italian Institute for International Political Studies in Milan. He is also the lecturer of European institutions and teaching assistant in international relations at the Catholic University of Milan, the university in which he also received his PhD in politics and institutions. He holds an MSc in political theory at the London School of Economics and Political Science. He is WP8 manager within the Green Global Reordering FP7 research project, funded jointly by the European Commission and the University of Warwick. Professor Zotti is an excellent teacher whose research interests includes European Union politics and policies, transnational regulation, international relations theory. So without further delay, I would like to pass on the floor to Somawa Basu, our president of Council for Global Cooperation, to start today's program with our most awaited guest. On to you, Somawa.
Thank you so much, Bhargavi, and thank you, Professor Zotti, for being here. Welcome to our CGC's discussion.
Very glad to be here with you.
To begin with the current Italian scenario, the recent general elections of 2022 has stirred not only debate within the nation, but also have been a trending affair among the intellectuals and pundits across the Europe and the world. So the election that brought Giorgia Meloni to power is considered to be the first right-wing government in the country post-war. And with this election, Italy is said to be Europe's another country to be ruled by right-wing populists. But if we see that every effect has a cause, let's start with the cause, or let's start with the beginning, if we say. In your opinion, what might have been the reason behind this rightward tilt? Or like, if you could briefly narrate to us the voter impulse that had been undergoing in Italy, and since when did the right-wing impulse start?
Right. So first of all, let me just get into a matter of not labels, but the nominations which are quite crucial in analyzing what's been happening in Italy over the last few decades. We can say that this is the first clearly right-wing oriented government in Italy, because we already had center-right governments in Italy, those led by Berlusconi, for example, by Silvio Berlusconi, starting right in the mid-90s and until 2011. That's one of the crucial aspects of the Italian political system. The fact that the coalition that has won the majority in the parliament after the recent general elections still dubs itself as a center-right coalition. Whereas it's quite clear, as you were pointing out, that this is a most decidedly right-wing government that we have in office right now. So the point is that, yes, this is a very right-oriented government, but still tries to keep at least the appearance of being a center-right government, despite the fact that the only center-right party, Forza Italia, the party of Silvio Berlusconi, only got 80% of the votes at the election. So it is not enough to define the nature of the coalition, but still they cling to that label, I will say, in order to appease not only the European allies in general, but also a part of the electorate which has been crucial to in the electoral success of Giorgia Meloni and her own party. That is the more affluent, economically developed regions of Italy in the northern part of the country. These regions, I would say that, and in saying that, I reconnect with the question about the reasons why we ended up with these sort of electoral result. These regions, I would say that they haven't particularly shifted their political allegiances toward a more I would say that, especially in northern Italy, there has been in place a sort of strategic vote among electors, meaning that center-right electors tend to vote for the party that is most likely to have a clear majority within the coalition and then within the parliament. So in that sense, we might sort of put into perspective the relevance of the general shift of the Italian population's ideology or electoral orientations towards center-right, because there is a big factor, in my view, that is explained in terms of strategic voting. On the other hand, though, we cannot overlook of the fact that there is these results. I would say that they evidence a sort of widespread malaise among the Italian population against certain issues, most of them economic in nature, that have been troubled the country for many years. The idea that Giorgia Meloni and the other allied parties, Lega and Forza Italia, have offered the electors is one of a management of national economy more clearly oriented towards a strong defense of national interests, which have been presented as being in a zero-sum relation with the interest of the European Union in general and the West. So in a sense, they tap into a narrative that presents Italy as a country that has been sort of tricked or taken advantage of by the European integration process. This, of course, is something that has been stated quite in clear terms, pretty much overlooking the contradiction that such a statement creates with the reassurances that the government and Giorgia Meloni as a candidate has put much commitment into to again reassure the European partners and international partners like the US, of course, about the international placement of Italy in terms of alliances, which remains firmly within the Western-oriented foreign policy that has been a tradition for Italy. So reassuring NATO allies, reassuring the other members of the European Union that Italy is not going to turn any other way, siding, for instance, with Russia or making preferential deals with China, but at the same time, advancing a project of, for instance, transforming, reorienting the European integration project towards a more intergovernmental form of polity, meaning that limiting or even reducing the powers of supranational institutions, like, for instance, European Commission or the Court of Justice of the European Union, and instead letting national governments take back some of their prerogatives and powers in order to direct the European integration project. So not being against the European Union, but at the same time remodule how the European Union works, what are the principles that the European Unions the entire European integration project rests on a more nationalistic intergovernmental modality of integration. And of course, some of other issues have entered the public discourse and the campaign that has been advanced by all three parties, which is a mild to strong anti-immigration stance, presenting Italy as being used as sort of the refugee camp of Europe, which in a sense, it's been the place, but that's more the result of the flaws of the international instruments that the European Union has been using to face the migration, the waves of migration flows starting in 2015, which assigned responsibility for the processing of asylum seekers' requests for the status of refugees to the country of first arrival. So seeing how much of the migration flows were coming from Northern Africa and the Eastern Mediterranean, it was only unfortunate, let's say, that it was Italy that would get the brunt of the migration waves, together with Greece, of course. But all three parties, and especially, of course, Lega and Fratelli d'Italia, were quite keen in presenting Italy not only being the victim of systemic flaws of the common migration policy, but also as sort of taken advantage of by other countries that used Italy to avoid to welcome refugees by their own. So these questions, I would say that first of all, it's economic reasons, but then we also have a rising significance of identitarian issues, like, for instance, the idea that Italy, which is also the victim of a very serious demographic crisis, Italy after Japan is the country with the most serious demographic crisis in the world, which only fuels conspiracy theories like the idea that there is a big plan to replace the Italian population with migrated population. This is something that Giorgia Meloni is responsible to spread out, has been responsible to spread out over the last few years. Of course, when it became clear that she had a clear shot at becoming president of the Council of Ministers, head of government in Italy, she she tuned down references to these conspiracy theories, but among the electorate, there was still the idea that she would be the right person to tackle with this problem if she had the opportunity to get the office.
Yes, Professor. So, there has been debates regarding, as you suggested, this is the most right-wing government Italy is going to witness for the first time. So, political analysts and journalists are bringing reference to Mussolini. They are bringing reference to fascism and Italy's authoritarian past. So, as an academic, what would be your opinion? Is this comparison accurate, or a journalistic hyperbole, or is it too early to predict?
Well, of course, we are still in the first days of the government. The cabinet per se is not even complete. We only have senior ministers. We still don't have all the subsecretaries of state. So we don't know. And the government hasn't taken any specific action. Well, references to the fascism regime and the historic experience of fascism in Italy are not something that can be just as easily dismissed as many would wish to do. It is a question. It is a very important question, not necessarily in terms of the consequences, meaning the actual policy orientation that the government will be able to embrace, but rather in terms of the kind of relations that this government is going to further and fuel with its population, meaning that it is no secret that part of the electorate, part of the people who voted for this coalition, and in particular for Fratelli d'Italia and Giorgia Meloni, they have sympathies. They are sort of nostalgic, but you also have to consider that the usual narrative about the fascist experience in Italy is one that justifies the very existence of the regime, telling simplified version of history, like the idea that yes, Mussolini was not that bad until he sided as strongly as he did with Hitler. If it wasn't for that, then the fascist regime in Italy would have looked more like something like Salazar in Portugal or Franco in Spain. So something that could have lived on for decades without being held responsible for something very unpleasant, like the enforcement of racial laws in the country. So in that sense, this is a very powerful narrative because it prevents people with these sympathies from dealing with the actual effect and the magnitude of keeping ties with this experience. So people that express these sympathies, they don't have to make the big leap of embracing theories, ideas, ideologies like recent neo-Nazis that imply a commitment to something that is very unpopular, many of these people say, oh no, it's just about having an effective government, being respected abroad and stuff like that. So having that in mind, so this quite this excusational approach to the fascist experience, to the fascist legacy in Italy, the ties are strong and are so significant that even a party like Lega, who originally had no significant tie with neo-fascist groups, had groomed these groups over the last few years, especially when it turned from being a party representing the interests of just the northern regions in Italy into a more nationalist party. So these groups are important, and right-wing parties in Italy know that. They know that they have to appeal them in order to have the edge to win elections, because of course they go for the center, they go for the moderate vote, but they know that people with these sort of sympathies, or if not a complete support for those ideas, who do not have a particularly strong stance against the fascist experience. People that just say, yes, maybe it was something that had its negative sides, but not all of that was to be condemned, because many things went the right way. Italy had been modernized by the fascist regime and things like that. So when we think of sympathies for the fascist history, we don't have immediately to go to the idea of extreme groups rooting for clear xenophobic or racist ideas. It is more relaxed in many of the people who feel sympathy for the regime. There is this more relaxed attitude, meaning that at the end of the day, it was not even a totalitarian system, it was more of an authoritarian system, and things at the end of the day were run smoothly. And it is a usual, it is something that there is a saying in Italy that is used to point out someone, to make fun of people with these sort of sympathies, when they say, at least back then trains would stick to timetables, meaning that thanks to Mussolini, we at least had that, trains that were not late. Considering that doesn't mean that we can rule out dangerous developments of this shift towards the right that the Italian political system has been subjected to. Giorgia Meloni has been quite clear, for instance, about her attitude towards LGBTQ plus rights. The very platform that the center-right coalition presented the voters with starts with the support that all three parties promised to grant to the traditional family, meaning that, of course, reproductive rights would not be a priority. In fact, they might even see measures to, if not eliminate them, if not to violate them, but to limit the possibilities of women and families to use instruments like artificial fertilization and medical procedures like that. They also ruled out the possibility of gay couples to adopt children and things like that. In that sense, we might say that the most likely, the clearest threats are against liberties more than the democratic system of the country. And in that sense, this coalition, it is certainly a populist radical right kind of coalition. What remains unclear is to what extent they're going to embrace extreme right ideas and attitudes, meaning that policy measures and ideological attitudes that not only tend to limit personal liberties, but also to impinge on the democratic system.
Yes, Professor. So, like, there is a chance of being an extreme right government and policy making in Italy, as you suggest. But there is one more phenomena which we have noticed, like, but this is not only common for Italy. This has been a populism is another factor which has been a notion that has been currently over Europe. Like if we have a look at the vote percentage, there has been an incredible growth of around 26% in favor of brothers of Italy. And it's not only in Italy, countries like France, Germany, Poland, and several others in Europe are seeing populist parties doing better in electoral politics. What is this reason behind this populist uprise in Europe?
Well, I would say that the reason is this basically the same that we can identify, for instance, in the US political system. It is an actual phenomenon that is, though, fueled and reinforced by the narratives produced by specific political actors and parties, that the biggest cleavage in today's European and the American societies, Western societies in particular, is the one between the winners and the losers of globalization. The idea that globalization created a big divide between the better offs, which are those that benefit from the fruits of globalization, those who have been granted more opportunities of traveling around, of knowing new countries, of advancing their careers thanks to these new ties and the expertise that they gain from all the opportunities provided by globalization, and a implicitly majoritarian part of the population that instead has paid the cost of the opening of markets that have led to companies to move their activities to third countries in Asia or in Eastern Europe, and so on and so forth. And the idea that even from even as far as values, political values are concerned, the idea that the rights and the views of these globalized part of society have sort of trumped the more traditional conservative views of the rest of the population that hasn't benefited so much from globalization. So the idea that urban globalized elites, they fight all the wrong fights, like for instance, looking for, as I was saying, LGBTQ rights to be protected and advanced. And so there is a part of the population that think by themselves, but it is also encouraged to do so by political entrepreneurs, to think that this part of the population only look after their own interests, and in doing so, they deprive them of the political and financial resources to face the negative repercussions, all the repercussions of globalization in terms of loss of job opportunities, and of alienation, on marginalization, of exposure to international phenomena like migration and competition from foreign companies and economic actors in general. So I think that the impact of globalization, which is something that actually happened and has created very unpleasant, harmful, I would say, consequences for big chunks of European populations, has been inflated, reinforced, re-narrated in more effective ways by so-called populist parties who have tried to benefit in electoral terms from this new political cleavage that has emerged within so many European political systems. And now it has come to roost, so to say, meaning that especially in Italy, for instance, over the last 5 years, we've had the first government led by an overtly populist party, so populist that he would even present itself as being transversal as far as the classic right-left political cleavage was concerned. Of course, I'm referring to the Five Star Movement. In that sense, they had their opportunity to implement populist policies. They tried it. They didn't prove to be particularly effective. And this is confirmed by the fact that in order to gain the more than respectable result in last month's election, they had to reorient the political platform towards a more clearly left-wing kind of populism. So in that sense, I would say that throughout Europe, we are witnessing a sort of tendency of the old right-wing political cleavage to reabsorb the populist divide, meaning that all the points, the political points presented and made by so-called populist parties are sort of recombining with more traditional right-wing or left-wing agendas, because that seems to be still relevant. And in order to be more effective in terms of policy design and implementation, it seems like populism has to be combined with more conservative or progressive political platforms. So in that sense, populism is still here, and it's here to remain, because I guess that the effects of globalization are going to stay with the population for a very long time, despite the fact that, for instance, the economic policy orientation of the European Union has already changed, especially since the pandemic. The European Union, even the Commission, the technocratic, so far very pro-globalization European Commission, has turned more protectionist in a sense. But the results of these shift in the orientation of the European Union and of many national governments are going to produce their results later in time. So for the time being, populism is going to stay with us, but more and more combined, I would say, with traditional right-wing or left-wing political platforms.
Thank you, Professor. So, coming to the foreign policy, if we see, there has been Melanie has stated herself as Atlanticist, and if you could describe this, what does he mean, and as well as what to expect from Italy's new foreign policy toward EU and uh, countries of NATO, and as well as US.
Yeah. So first of all, let me point out the fact that Italy, unlike other big countries like the UK or France, has tried throughout the decades after World War II to combine a pro-European with a pro-US, pro-Atlantic stance, which is something that was not the case with for France. For France, it was usually the case that being pro-European meant was sort of a political expression of the intolerance of the presence of Americans in European affairs, and the other way around for the United Kingdom. Italy has a history of trying to combine as far as possible the two foreign policy orientations. I would say that the commitment of Giorgia Meloni and, as far as possible, of our entire government towards a loyal relation with the United States, with the Atlantic Alliance, is going to be maintained, if only because I guess that Meloni could have gained even more in terms of votes if she had taken a more ambiguous position towards the relations that her government, her future government, would maintain with, for instance, the United States, because part of the electorate, especially those voters who are not moderate voters who strategically voted for Meloni, but those who are convinced right-wing voters, part of those have no problem with expressing their negative attitudes toward what they say as a subordination to the national interests of the United States. And for instance, they are quite they express clear negative opinion about Italy's involvement in the provision of weapons to the Ukrainian army against the Russian invasion. Meloni had a clear opportunity at benefiting from these orientations, which are quite widespread across the Italian population. According to a poll that had been conducted by the German Marshall Fund recently, a few months before the election, whereas in most Western European countries, more than half of the population, up to 80% of the population in some cases, were quite pro the support of the government towards the Ukrainian fight against Russians. Only 38% of Italians declared that they were supporting the aid in terms of supplying of arms and weapons to the Ukrainian army. So that doesn't mean, of course, that the rest of the population is clearly pro-Russia, but and these can be seen in many of the claims and in the very political platform that Movimento 5 Stelle presented it during the campaign. The idea is that, yes, we are going to remain, we are going to maintain our alliances, our ties with our allies in America and in Europe, but there is no need for us to get directly involved in this war. So we might as well just stop giving them weapons, since the US is already doing that. And since the amount, the magnitude, the size of our support is not going to change the way that this war ends, we might as well stop doing that and trying to present ourselves as negotiators between Ukraine and Russia. So there is already this very ambiguous position, not only among voters who opted for center-right parties at the last elections, but also among voters that voted for the Democratic Party, and most of those who voted for Movimento 5 Stelle. Considering that the fact that Meloni did not seize that opportunity might be regarded, at least for the time being, as quite compelling proof of her genuine commitment to her alliance with, to the system of alliances that Italy has traditionally been holding to since World War II. At the same time, though, I have more doubts about, as I was saying before, her pro-European Union stance, for the same reasons that I already mentioned. So yes, support for the European Union, because being part of the European Union is a big part of the Western placement of Italy within the international system. But as far as the European Union is concerned, that support goes more towards the idea of the European Union more as just a collection of countries that should retain as much power as possible vis-a-vis the European Union institutions like the European Commission. And so it's more ambiguous because, for instance, the government has already been praised, and very strongly so, by, for instance, the President of the Republic of Poland and by the Prime Minister of Hungary, who also share analogous views on many political issues with Giorgia Meloni. At the same time, though, the degree to which the Meloni government is going to be able to actually implement this agenda of transforming the European Union, I have more doubts about that. First of all, because, for instance, this alliance that doesn't exist, is just a potential alliance with Poland and Hungary, is made quite difficult by the fact that Poland, as conservative as it is, has for a long list of historical and political reasons, one of the staunchest position against Russia. Whereas the Hungarian government is more ambiguous, if not at least as far as the energy supply problem is concerned, is much more soft in its participation, in its condemnation about Russia's action in Ukraine. So these already drives a wedge between these three potential allies in this front that should, in the opinion of many commentators, change how the European Union is structured and works. But and there's also to consider the fact that, as I was saying, among many of those voters who voted strategically for Meloni are many entrepreneurs and people who work in northern Italy, and the northern part of Italy is deeply connected with the rest of Europe. The value chains that exist between Italy, especially northern Italy and Germany, are strong. and they have no interest at all in having a government that takes nationalistic stances against the European Union, and in doing so disrupts their businesses.
Just coming to the point which you mentioned, that it's true that Italy and Germany has a distinct history of being a non-homogeneous entity. Like there is differences between southern Italy and northern Italy, and even every part of Italy have distinct identities. So how confident is this government in ruling Italy as a united entity?
That's a very interesting question, because this might be an edge that Giorgia Meloni and her party have, compared, for instance, to the attempt that Salvini, the leader of Lega, made during the last 5 years in representing also the southern part of Italy. Meloni, so the very surprise of the result that Meloni managed to achieve was the fact that the northern part of Italy, which had never seen with particular favor Fratelli d'Italia, trusted her and voted strategically for her, despite having been historically being closer to parties like Forza Italia or Lega Nord, whereas being a post-fascist, more nationalistic party, Fratelli d'Italia is more, let's say, less strongly supportive of a liberal political platform, meaning that Fratelli d'Italia, yes, it declares to be pro-market, but at the same time, it's also ambiguous on that, because it is a party that represents itself as the one that advances the interest of the losers of the globalization. So in that sense, Fratelli d'Italia offers a political receipt to voters that contains protection, support, both economically and in other forms. So in that sense, it was quite a surprise that whereas southern voters, it was quite clear that those who wouldn't vote for Movimento 5 Stelle would vote for Fratelli d'Italia, because Fratelli d'Italia doesn't push that much on liberalization, on economic reforms, on making social and economic structures more efficient, in empowering economic forces to evolve, but rather on protecting little and middle-sized enterprises. It was quite interesting to see instead voters in the north who are much more, whose businesses are much more integrated with the rest of Europe, to also trust Meloni. So in this sense, Meloni has a electoral legitimacy that comes from both parts of the country, and that's of course a big plus for her. At the same time, it will be pretty hard to keep at the same time all the promises that have been made, or at least implied, meaning that the promise of granting protection economically and socially and in security issues to people living in poorer regions in the south is going to be at odds with instead the interest of northern regions, and especially entrepreneurs in northern regions, who want more integration, who want more efficiency, who want who want economic reforms to be able in the views to maximize the efficiency of the company's operations. That, of course, also has to another big disappointment, likely big disappointment. I'm not saying that it's 100% sure that this is going to occur, but another aspect that is going to be very delicate and Meloni will have to navigate around very carefully is this idea of reducing fiscal pressure on the population. That, of course, is always something that that wins politicians great support from the population. At the same time, though, it doesn't necessarily go hand in hand with the idea of being the party that is going to provide active support and protection to the population, because it would imply a downsizing of the public budget of the Italian government. And that is something that might create big problems. So right now, Meloni is in an even better position than Salvini was 5 years ago in being politically representative of many parts of Italy, not just one part of the country. At the same time, though, that electoral support is going to take very good, smart, new ideas not to create disappointments in either businesses in the north or the population that waits for support and protection in the south.
That's an interesting insight. Like if we see that, as you stated, that Giorgia Meloni enjoys support from both the northern as well as voters from north as well as south. That might be a plus. That might be a positive factor for her government. But if we see, like the lefts, the rights do not have the homogeneity as well. Like if we were seeing, like taking into account the long-lasting support and close connections of Salvini and Berlusconi's with Putin's regime, as well as the recent leaked audio tapes of Berlusconi, which has been on news, and also if we consider Meloni's Eurosceptic comments and support for Orban's illiberal democracy, to what extent is this coalition's new stance in foreign policy as well as in domestic policy believable, or it's like to sustain? Yeah.
Well, I would say that it is more believable in the foreign policy sphere than it is in the domestic one, meaning that Italy is tied to many external constraints. One of them is, of course, Italy's huge public debt, which reduces significantly the leeway that the government has in repositioning itself vis-a-vis the other members of the European Union and the European Union institutions. Italy, all governments, whether they know that from the very beginning or not, once they come into office, they have to face the hard reality of them being tied to the European Union because of the trust that the European Union constantly puts in Italy, despite the very poor public finance performance of Italian government. Most of them, of course, because of course the European Union was quite happy with what Mario Draghi was doing until a few months ago. But in general, big plans of completely turning the ship in terms of public spending or fiscality, they are mostly frustrated because of these external constraints. And also in terms of diplomatic, political ties, as said, Italy does not have this big space to maneuver around its traditional alliances, also because if the European Union, we must remember that Italy is among the biggest beneficiaries of the significant amount of financial resources that have been put in place by the European Union in order to recover from the social and economic repercussions of the pandemic. So if Italy was to take a more ambiguous position towards Russia, the European Union itself and the other member states would waste no time in reminding the government who's financing the recovery of their economy, especially considering that much of this money has still to be received and used by the Italian government. So it's not just a gift that has already been presented. Within the domestic sphere, on the other hand, I think that many of the voters have voted for this government already knowing that, not trusting the political platform that the coalition presented itself during the campaign. Also because this political platform, the document contained in it, is very vague, ambiguous, it's very short, it doesn't take specific commitments apart from, as I was saying, in protecting traditional family, being pro-NATO and pro-European Union, and a few other things. And apart from an idea of cutting taxes, which has always been part of the political program of the center-right coalition since Berlusconi entered the political arena in Italy, I would say that each of the different types of voters who voted for Meloni and Fratelli d'Italia, they have already discounted the idea that they're not going to be able not to disappoint someone. So it's sort of a bet. They know that there are many contradictions. They know that not all the things that they've promised can be actually be brought to light, but they have sort of bet that it's the promise that they counted on that it is going to be kept. So in a few years, I think that the government is very likely to have to face the disappointment of parts of the population. I mean, even on the foreign policy side, if you look at comments of people posting comments on articles of online newspapers, you can see that many of them, they are against the US. They express very anti-Atlanticist stances, and they sort of act as they are disappointed because of what Giorgia Meloni claimed in front of the parliament. So they already thought that she would claim something like that during the campaign, and then as soon as she would take office, she would just reconsider her ideas and saying that, yes, I'm not with the Americans because the Americans are the representatives of interests that are at odds with Italy's. And I guess that if that happened with foreign policy, which was one of the points where Giorgia Meloni was at her clearest in saying what her position was, I guess that the same kind of disappointment is bound to emerge when the government is going to implement its measures in economic policy. And we also have to consider that the figure that has been picked for the very delicate position of Minister for Economic Affairs, he's a member of Salvini's Lega, but even though both he and Salvini have said that, have stated to newspaper in interviews and publicly that there is no problem at all in the mutual relationship, it is quite clear that Giorgetti, the new Minister for Economic Affairs, he's very much not in line with the ideas prevailing in his own party about not complying with European Union regulations and orientations. So in that sense, there is not only divergences between parties, members of the center-right, so-called center-right coalition, but even within parties, we have different positions. And so we have these members of Lega, which is at the same time is a staunch defenders of compliance with European Union rules and regulations, whereas on the other hand, we have the leader of the party who's been at best ambiguous, is if not openly contrary to respecting the limitations and constraints that the European Union imposes on Italian governments.
That's nice. If like we covered topics like on foreign policy, Italy's relations with EU, NATO, and even the Russia-Ukraine crisis. But what will be Italy's stance on China, or what will be the China policy for Italy? Will they because Italy is one of the focal point of the BRI project, which the Chinese had stated in their plan. So do you think that will the Meloni government permit pending BRI projects, or would it be like something stance that would be towards US? So I wanted to know, like, where does Italy stand between the great power competition between US and China?
Yes, well, on this, the Meloni government is going to, I guess that they're going to draw some teachings from what the Conte government, the Movimento 5 Stelle's led government, tried to do in terms of international repositioning towards China. They tried to do that, they weren't very effective, and they've paid the political price for that. So I guess that Meloni doesn't have to look very back in the past in order to draw some lectures from what are the most likely consequences of trying a realignment of that kind. Of course, as you were aptly pointing out, Italy has interest in having friendly relationships with China, and I guess this is something that is going to continue without though implying reconsidering the kind of relations that the government is going to have with the US. I guess that the Meloni government is going to keep as good relations as possible with China, but never at the cost of impinging on the quality of its political and economic relations with the US. We also have to consider this, that many of the pro-Russian stances that can be detected, among center-right voters and politicians and newspapers and within the public opinion in general, are usually expressed in terms of China being the actual biggest problem that we should arm ourselves and face quite seriously. So the idea among these pro-Russian voters or politicians is that we are looking at the wrong source of dangers here. So we shouldn't so much side all against Russia, but we should instead side with Russia against China. So in that sense, this is a further reinforcement of the orientation of the cautious approach to the relations with China that the Meloni government is going to have, not only because it's the traditional orientation of the Italian governments that would advise her to do so, but also because some of her more extreme right-wing support that she gets wouldn't see positively the Italy getting closer to China, even if at the expense of a relation that these right-wing voters don't see with a good eye, of course, either, that is the relation with the US. So I would say that, yeah, these, even the most strongly nationalist, jingoist part of the voters and of the political elites of Fratelli d'Italia would go rather for a would go rather for ruining relations with the US, but not in order to make relations with China better. But considering that Meloni has expressed much more moderate positions, I would say that the Meloni government is never going to deliberately try to make their relations with China better at the expense of the relations that the country entertains with both Europe and the US.
But Professor, during the times of Cold War, we have seen that Soviet Union have always preferred their first preference over the current regimes, whether it is right or left. They always preferred their preference over the first or the current regime. Then they preferred, when they were unsuccessful, they preferred regimes which are then they preferred the anti-regime forces. So even this is a kind of pattern which China also follows, in case of Europe as well, or the countries in Africa, where China has good relations with right-wing parties in exchange of ideologies and meetings. So if China is successful in doing some kind of ideological balance or meetings between brothers of Italy and the coalition government parties, so do you think there can be a different scenario in the upcoming future?
Well, it is possible, but I don't see it as very likely. I would think that China will keep on trying to keep the European Union as separate as possible. That is, in trying to play each of the member states out against the others, offering someone better conditions than the others in order to create divergences and cleavages among them. Because of course it's in the best interest of China that the European Union remains as divided as possible. Even though, as far as, for instance, the trade policy is concerned, national governments do not have that big of a say in what the European Commission does. We should remember that. We should keep in mind that trade agreements are negotiated and signed by the European Union on behalf of the countries. Countries cannot negotiate their own trade agreements, as, for instance, the British government had to learn the hard way right after Brexit. So in that sense, yes, China is going to keep to her strategy of trying to keep the European Union member states as divided as possible, but I don't know how much they're going to be able to find leverage on these wave of radical or extreme right-wing parties who are the fact is that these parties, as far as they have a common ideology, is also one that is for pan-European nationalism more than siding with transnational right-wing ideologies. So much of the ideological platform that these parties rest on is very much xenophobic in terms of Europe versus the rest of the world. And so China is very unlikely to be seen as a potential ally, maybe a tactical ally, but never a strategic ally.
Thank you, Professor. Coming to the last question, how do you think, how do the people of Italy think that this government would be, are they optimistic about this government to complete 5-year tenure, or there can be certain changes in the constitution? Because I was seeing that Italy, this is the 68th government of Italy post-World War. So there has been the history of ups and downs, and there has been history of unstable government. So is there any chance of where constitution can be amended, or is there any chance where the government can fall in the upcoming?
Well, as far as constitutional reforms are concerned, in my view, they are very unlikely to succeed. First of all, because they won a clear majority, but not to the extent that they can reform the constitution by themselves. In order to reform the constitution in Italy, bills have to be passed and by a 2/3 of both chambers of the parliament twice. And as we already said, the level of homogeneity within the coalition is not such to make sure that even all the MPs of the three winning parties are going to vote for the same reform project, much less that they can find support from the rest of the parliament. So they would have to submit, if they vote that by an absolute majority and not a reinforced majority, they should submit the bill to the scrutiny of a referendum. And referendums are very dangerous. The last prime minister that invested basically its entire political career in that paid the price for that. So I guess that they're going to be very cautious about that. Another thing is that the kind of reform that are included in the political platform, according to the political platform, Italy should be changed into a presidential or semi-presidential system, which hasn't proved quite efficient across the world. So I guess that they would get the opposition of scholars, because yes, of course, executive stability has been the weak spot of the Italian political constitutional system since its very inception after World War II. But the idea that a presidential system provides more stability, it's at best to be proven. And there are many much more compelling examples of very stable systems which are still parliamentarian, like Germany. And so it is quite evident that there are other factors apart from the form of government at play. And there are lots of political figures, constitution scholars in law and constitutional law that are going to present these arguments very strongly in the Italian public opinion, and in the Italian public discourse, scientific and public in general. As for the stability of this government, I think that it is even less sure that the government is going to last for 5 years. This is just my view, but as far as I can see from all the things that we talk about, I see it as very unlikely. I don't say that it is extremely likely that there are going to be changes in the government to the point that maybe they have to go through what in Italy we call rimpasto, meaning since the prime minister doesn't have the constitutional power to change ministers alone, but it has to ask the president of the republic to change them for them. If the number of ministers that change at once is considerable, the government has officially to fall and go through another confidence vote. So that is extremely likely to happen. Then I guess that the second level of likelihood is that someone else is going to take the place of prime minister, because the Meloni government might be failing. And then, of course, as the most remote possibility is that the parliament gets dissolved before its natural expiration date. But I would say that in the degrees of likelihood of things to occur is this, that major changes are going, that this government is going to have to go through major changes, not only in terms of the ministers that are part of it, but also in terms of the orientations, that a different prime minister is going to take the place of Giorgia Meloni, and as a more remote possibility that the parliament is going to be dissolved and early elections are going to be called.
Thank you so much, Professor. We couldn't keep a track of time, like how hours passed, but it was a great conversation, and it was a great time of analysis which we received from you on this important topic, which is currently been discussed through all over the world, as well as Italy and in European Union. So
yes.
Thank you for your time for joining this conversation and giving us this opportunity to have a conversation with you. And
you're welcome. It was great for me as well.
And thank you, Adarsh, for organizing this wonderful event and platform for us. And we thank the viewers of CGC for your interest and viewing this event. Thank you.